Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining me today on this webinar on the topic of the future of preventative healthcare. And I'm delighted to have two of my distinguished friends as panelists for this session. We're positioned this as a debate about the strategies for and technologies for preventative healthcare, looking at one side from the perspective of precision medicine and clinician developed and managed vaccines, drugs and other kinds of therapies that are designed to keep our vital functions in order, against, on the other hand, the use of technologies and strategies which empower citizens to better manage their own health and indeed give people more responsibility for looking after themselves. So I know it's not a black and white story, but on the one side, or in the red corner, or the red, very multicolored corner, as you can see on the screen, is Steve Gardner. He's the CEO and founder of PrecisionLife. Steve's had a lot of experience in the use of precision medicine for a variety of purposes, and he appears to have popped up twice on my screen now for some reason, but we will carry on. So Steve is going to be talking about his work with big data analytics and precision medicine technologies and strategies, and then on the other hand, Jaoa, is that right, Jaoa? Bocas. He is known as the Wearables expert, and he's one of the world's leading experts in the use of wearable technologies for healthcare and well-being. So these are my expert panelists, and what I want to do to begin with is try to put this into perspective by showing a few slides which give a little bit of background to the proceedings. So I'm going to share screen again, and I'm going to now so I positioned today's session as two sides of a coin. On the one side, where we have Steve's pictures, we're looking at clinician responsibility, medical solutions, which include vaccines, drugs, surgery, therapies, embedded devices, etc. And on the other side, we have Jaoa, who's going to be talking about the wearable technologies and how they can support citizen responsibility in personal health management, and encourage people to exercise, control their diet, meditation, lifestyle, all those kind of things. But I would also like to ask all of our delegates at this point to answer a slight polling question on where you think the priorities ought to be, or where you think the focus for preventative healthcare. So I've loaded up a polling question, and the question is, if you had to choose, where would your priority be for investment in preventative healthcare? Would it be in life sciences and the development of vaccines, drugs, devices, etc., which manage our vital functions automatically, or would it be in health and well-being solutions and strategies that empower citizens and give people greater responsibility for their personal health management? So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think about that and make your answer. I know you can all see the responses, which is good. I hope it doesn't influence your own personal opinion. So what we've got is a majority of people feel that it should be, if you're given the choice, the investment should be focused on health and well-being solutions and strategies. Okay, so I'm going to end polling there. I just will share the results for those of you who haven't seen it. So 83% think it's to do with citizen responsibility, and 17% more to do with clinician responsibility. So to set the scene, I'm not sure whether you can hear any audio whilst this is going on. So I just wanted to put this in context and say that where we are in the UK with lockdown, we've been here before, but fortunately we don't live in the kind of regime that they had in the 1600s, and this is a couple of pictures from 1664 when they had the plague of London, and if we think we are having severe times with our lockdown, if you lived in those times, you actually had greater restrictions than we have now. And this is a little piece from a newspaper up in Northallerton where they had a plague in the 1600s. This was similar to what happened in London, that people were locked inside their houses and they employed guards to stand outside to make sure that they didn't leave. And these guards in Northallerton were allowed to use violence to enforce the lockdown. And people found in breach of curfew could be whipped, and if they had a plague sore on their body, they could be hanged. Fortunately, things have moved on from those times, but it just shows that even going back all those centuries, people dealt with a virus or a plague in a very similar way to what we're seeing now. So the preventative healthcare question for you today: should we focus on clinician-led solutions designed to develop vaccine drugs and digital devices that control all vital functions, or should our focus be on strategies and solutions that empower citizens with the control of and responsibility for their personal health management? Now I'd like to just bring up one or two slides that just reflect on where we are today, and how we've gone between over the last century, 1900 to 2021, looking at the top causes of death and how they've changed over that period. And what we've seen is a shift from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases, which are generally lifestyle related. And if we also look at how healthcare has improved and had an impact on life expectancy over the last 3 centuries, we can see that back in the 1700s, the life expectancy was as low as 35 years. But now we're up into the 80s in Europe, and in the high 70s in the Americas, and in Africa, which is lags behind a bit, it's around about 58. So we're living longer, but with a decline in birth rate, and also the fact that older people tend to get sicker than most people, we're entering a crisis that's known as the aging society, where the burden of cost is falling on a smaller and small proportion of working people. The other factor that I'd like to bring into the equation is the fact that lifestyle conditions like obesity, preventable lifestyle conditions, are responsible for much of the premature mortality that we're seeing today. And the question, and we do have solutions which are based on both sides of the fence, whether we're talking about things like gastric surgery, or we're talking about drugs and therapies which help people to lose weight. We have solutions on both sides which help to tackle obesity. Looking at the kind of technologies that we have seen emerging disruptively within the area of medicine, the doctor's medicine bag and the kind of sensor technologies and readings that clinicians take to measure how well you are have changed very little over centuries, in fact, or certainly decades. But today, with the digital technologies, we have a lot of devices which are not only available to the medical profession, but they're also available and affordable and used by consumers. And if we look at the trend in technology, that's not just being seen within medicine, but it's also being seen within all kinds of technologies. We're moving from an era where technologies were primarily designed and used by professionals, whether they're clinicians or whether they're teachers or whatever profession you're in. The technologies tended to be developed as proprietary. They were dumb and they tended to be unconnected. Now with the digital revolution, we have a whole load of technologies which are no longer so proprietary. They're generic. They have the same kind of embedded technologies within them. They are smart and they are connected. And what's this resulted in is a shift away from professional focused technologies towards consumer technologies. The other factor I just want to mention is that to ask the question of whether we are moving into an era where our reliance on drugs is becoming a bit of a problem for society, both in terms of drug resistance, antibiotics particularly, and also in the USA particularly, the area of addiction, which is causing severe problems. So this is the background to it, and I now want to move on to the first of the presentations, and I'm going to ask Steve Gardner to talk about his work within precision medicine. So Steve, the floor is yours. You can share your slides with everyone if you wish.
So hopefully you can see my slides, David.
We can, yeah.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk on this topic. I know I've been chosen to front one side of it. I have to say my personal opinions will become clear as I go through this presentation. But what I specialize in is analyzing large-scale disease populations. So these are patient subgroups who've got some really complex diseases. And one of the things I've spent many years doing is figuring out how to stratify those patient subgroups into more well-delineated groups of patients for whom the causes of disease and the potential treatments for those diseases might be quite different. So this in the center, this rather colorful graph here is actually the results of an analysis on schizophrenia patients. And it's really difficult to get schizophrenia patients onto the right medications. What we've done here is to take it away from a single diagnostic label and turn it into a series of communities of patients who share the same basic causes. And you can see that we have a pink group of patients and a green and a red and a blue. And the tiny little dots in there are the mutations on the genes that are associated with their form of disease. And, you know, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the Human Genome Project, and that's given us huge amounts of data that we can use to analyze these kind of differences and get under the skin of these complex diseases to a much greater effect. And if you can do that, then you can identify areas of unmet medical need and you can find new drug targets. You can develop patient stratification biomarkers and hopefully have smaller, faster, and better, clearer signals from clinical trials. And you can also, in a clinical context, you can make decisions. If you know if you know that a patient is in the pink group, and you know what's driving disease for that particular patient population, you can guide them to a more effective therapy rather quicker. So all of these things are very helpful. What it also enables is something that I'm going to come back to, which is personalization of things like digital health tools. And I'm going to illustrate all of these points very quickly. So what are we basically doing? Well, when we do most of our analyses, what typically happens in genetics is we look for mutations that occur more in a patient population than in a control population. And that's fine. It kind of works for cancers and rare diseases. But chronic diseases, the things that David was talking about, the dementias, the diabetes, the cardiovascular diseases, immunological diseases, respiratory diseases, they're complex. They have many different causes and many different influences. And we need to be able to reflect all of those when we do the analysis. And so bringing together combinations of these features, it gives us more bins into which we can put our patient population. It lets us stratify them at higher resolution. And now we can look at two subgroups of patients and we can say, what's the same or what's different between these patients? The same because it may reveal the underpinnings of disease, and different because it may tell us why they're exhibiting different responses and allow us to choose and personalize therapies for them. And just to illustrate the fact, we have huge amounts of data now, not just sequencing, but transcriptomics, digital medical records, high quality imaging, lifestyle, of course, sensors, wearables, huge amounts of information that we need to bring into these analyses. So that fundamentally enables a choice between a hard way and an easy way. And to me, the hard way is to figure out a mutation that's causing a disease and go and make a new drug against it. That is, whatever you do, that's going to take you 10 years and cost an awful lot of money to actually bring that to market. The easy way is to stop people getting the disease in the first place. And that's all about wellness. That's all about making sure that people understand their personal risks and are able to be given tools to manage them. The middle way is really to look at the existing drugs that we have on the formulary and be able to prescribe them effectively to the right patients. And that's really where we can go with some of this analysis. This is an example looking at asthma. And there are two forms of asthma. One is the traditional allergic inflammatory disease that people think of when they think of asthma. And there's 4 new biologic therapies. They cost a lot of money, but they're very effective. Trouble is, they only work for 70% of the patient population. And if you're given the diagnosis of asthma, you don't know which of those groups you fall into. So doing this type of analysis, this high resolution stratification, allows us to take the allergic form of the disease. So the patients on the left here have these genes and pathways that are driving their disease. The patients on the right have a totally different profile of causes to their disease. They may be called the same thing by the clinician, but they're actually 2 different diseases. And that's a really clear signal, and it's something that we can use to improve the diagnosis and treatment. Same is true in rheumatoid arthritis. Should you be given what's called a DMARD, a disease-modifying anti-rheumatoid drug? Should you be given one of the new antibodies, anti-TNF antibodies? Hugely expensive. They work at different stages of the disease, and in order to stop a patient progressing through to the more serious forms of disease where you have non-reversible joint damage, you want to get patients on the right drug at the right point. And so it's critically important to be able to stratify what's driving their disease. Same is true in asthma, in diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is probably the most expensive disease to treat. In the US, it's about 18% of the healthcare spend, which itself is about 18% of GDP. It's $440 billion spent specifically on the complications of type 2 diabetes. And that can be renal failure, it can be neuropathies leading to blindness, it can be cardiovascular effects like heart attack and stroke, or ulcers and amputations. So we use this kind of stratification to build a model that predicts at the point of diagnosis which trajectory a patient is going to go on. Are they going to get no complications, in which case they're relatively low risk? Are they going to get serious complications like blindness or renal failure, which is going to cost an awful lot to get on dialysis? So being able to predict that is very, very powerful, because it then sets up a whole series of things that you can do. So take this knowledge, turn it into a clinical decision support tool, and then empower prescriptions that are made by doctors. Yes, absolutely. Really important thing to be able to do. However, I've got to come clean. I voted for health and well-being. And here's why. Because if these patients are not turning up sick in the clinic, they're not costing the health service a lot of money. So what can we do to avoid that? Well, you can use that same knowledge with the personal profile of an individual across all of their information to drive personalized digital health tools. And you can have dietary interventions to stop people getting type 2 diabetes. Here's the key word though, personalized. We want to stop it being purely eat less processed carbs and do more exercise. That doesn't resonate with people. They need to know something about themselves. And so you need to bring in the wearables and the monitoring and the patient reported outcomes into this process to get the virtuous circle. You also need to know something about this patient. You know, it's no good just making one size fits all medicines and one size fits all predictions. You have to be able to tailor your information. That's what we did with one of the tools that David alluded to earlier, which is a personalized dietary advisor. We took all of the drug disease, drug food interactions, all of the allergens and pharmacogenomic interactions, and we built a knowledge model of which drugs work with which foods and which diseases. We put that on a mobile phone, and in real time, it goes through any set. This is connected to Tesco's shopping baskets, and it goes through all the foods in your basket, all the ingredients in them, and gives you a traffic light display of what is going to work for you, given your combination of diseases and drugs. So it's not just you're diabetic, it's you are Uncle Albert here, and the things that are actually going to work for you. And that helps you learn about your disease. And I think the combination of all of those things is actually the answer to this problem, David.
Okay, that's wonderful. Is that the end of your presentation, Steve?
It is. Yep.
It is. Okay, if you stop sharing your screen, so we can we see you? Well, I just wonder if there are any questions at this point. We don't have anything in the Q&A. That's just to remind people that if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A rather than the chat. You will have an opportunity to ask both Steve and Jaoa at the end of the session. So we don't have any questions. I think we'll go back and we'll touch on some of the things that you've said. I'd just like to ask you, though, a question about genomics and the current COVID crisis. One of the things that I've heard said several times is that with these different mutations of the virus, people behind the Oxford vaccine have said that they would be able to make an adjustment to the vaccine within a relatively short period to be able to tackle the mutation. Yeah. That doesn't seem to align with what you were saying about it taking years to understand the effect of different mutations. So what would your comments on that?
Well, the Oxford vaccine is a challenge vaccine. So essentially you're putting an antibody into a system to produce, an antigen into a system to produce to produce a response where you can then identify the cells that are actually going to produce antibodies against that. So it's a much easier problem to solve perhaps than some of the mRNA approaches, which may be a little bit more challenging. But fundamentally, that's quite different from the business of building drugs, because you have to get very close to the underlying mechanism that's associated with each specific piece of biology. You have to understand it in exquisite detail, and that's actually pretty hard to do with novel drugs. Plus, the clinical trials process doesn't allow for very much speed up once you've got out of the early stages of trials.
I've got a couple of questions in. One from Andrew Cowan. How does precision vital signs remote monitor for infants play into your vision of preventative? Is it a support tool or deployed into the community, or both?
I think it can be both. It very much depends on the infants involved, and whether, particularly when there are certain types of genetically determined diseases, it may very well be that early detection of those and early monitoring of those is a very good way of preventing non-reversible damage in those infants. And I certainly know of examples of quite idiopathic rare diseases where patients have taken so long to get a diagnosis that the treatments that they've undergone in the period have actually probably done them as much harm as the therapy eventually did. I think a support tool as well. Patients are going to learn about their own health. If you look at things like cystic fibrosis, tools to enable youngsters to learn how much they benefit from the physiotherapy that they go through when they're clearing their lungs on a daily basis. It's 2 hours of rigorous physiotherapy. They have to feel that there's a benefit to that, and being able to monitor that and to correlate when they did that with the better outcomes that they have for their health, I think is really important. So the answer is a little bit of both, I think.
Yeah, there's a question from Colleen Monaghan, which I'm going to leave till later on because it touches on some of the things that I wanted to talk about. But it's a very, very good question about the responsibility for the cost of developing these kind of strategies. So I'm now going to hand over to Jaoa, and I'm going to ask him to take over and do his presentation.
Brilliant, fantastic. Can you all see my screen now?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. And Steve, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. Very, very, very good, really. And David, thank you so much for the invite, and nice to see you anyway, and connecting with anyone else. So from my side, I wouldn't say I stand from one side only of the coin in an argument. Why? Because I believe probably is a combination of either side, the precision side with wearables and preventative measures and interventions. But from my side, I want to give a bit of an overview of my vision, my beliefs, but also bring to light a lot of the things that I've been doing now in the wearable space. I come from the wearables side, so my name is Jaoa Bocas. I work a lot with wearables, and I follow all these new emerging technologies. So I really believe in terms of vision, I believe the future of healthcare is self-care, where the patient will be empowered, but also we take responsibility for our own health, whether that is with a wearable or without a wearable, but I believe that's really the future of healthcare. And what is interesting in here to understand is the role of wearable technologies in our daily lives. And also, it can be seen as a bit of a precision intervention, a personalized intervention. It is not really a precision medicine intervention, but is a personalized intervention. And in terms of digital trends, for example, last year in 2020, the American College of Sports Medicine named wearable technologies the #1 trend. And in here, we're talking about more of the fitness industry and the wellness industry in a way. And David already mentioned some of the lifestyle diseases that can be prevented. The heart disease, as David mentioned in a very first presentation, the heart disease continues to be the #1 cause of death. And of course, that a lot of those can be prevented: diabetes, cancer, hypertension, and obesity. And as you well know, obesity was considered by the World Health Organization a disease right now. But that goes hand in hand with the cardiovascular disease, because a lot of people die from cardiovascular disease is from or diabetes or even obesity on its own. And I want to bring your attention to the future of medicine by this thought leader, well-known cardiologist, known digital health influencer, Eric Topol. And he wrote a book called The Patient Will See You Now, where he turns really the concept of medicine upside down, giving the patient the responsibility to take care of their own health. Very interesting book. I strongly recommend it. I've been through it myself, and even mentioned that the smartphone is is all you need in the future, because you have the doctor in your pocket, if you like. And here are some of the examples from the Alivacore to some hearables, a new Huawei G2 watch with the SPO2, some of the wireless scales, the Oura ring, the smart rings, the glucometers, the things that we consider now to be available in the marketplace to look after our health and use in terms of wearables. There's some wearable technology trends, because we're moving a lot away from the smart watches and wristbands. And I'll give you an example. One of the leading research companies last year in 2020 found out that 46% of the market share from smartwatches and fitness band decreased to 39%. That tells me that the wearables are taking different forms and in different ways. Now the sensing technologies are very, very powerful, but you can see there that we have ECG monitoring, blood pressure, smart rings, smart clothing. We even have smart belts. The wearables and the sensing technologies that go more or less anywhere that you can expect. And this is an example of a pharma company partnered with Apple to do a study on from the pharma industry to using Apple Watch with ECG capabilities to do, they call the project the Heartline, for arterial fibrillation to diagnose patients. It's actually a very large cohort of patients, about 130,000. And they were over 65-year-olds. But you can see their digital technologies combined with wearables will be the norm. And here's some of the device-related barriers that I encounter. I've done actually about a 1-year study on health wearables engagement, and we went through a lot of different things, even done face-to-face interviews to people using wearables. And these are some device barriers that we identified: the interoperability, battery issues. Even though the wearables now, they're becoming more reliable with better battery lives, but on average, probably they last from 3-4 days to maximum a week. So if you're doing a large study around a certain condition or a clinical trial that you need 2-3 weeks or even 2 or 3 months of data, the wearables are very still limited in their own capability. The lack of personalization also, and here Steve mentioned, of course, personalization is the crucial and the critical aspect in here. The wearables still failing to be personalized because they kind of manufacture in a way for the consumer market. And also lack of support and no direction. The consumers also see that there is no support in terms of using them and carry on using them, because one of the issues is the lack of a long-term engagement. And here are some of the user-related barriers. We touched about the device side of things, and here the user side of things, the lack of intrinsic motivation, why we use a wearable in the first place. Is different for everybody, and personalization again is the key. We engage in a different way. For example, right now I'm interested in my sleep. a few years ago, I was interested in my physical activity. I'm not tracking that right now, but the wearables are great for that, but also the users sometimes they might not connect intrinsically with wearable, and then therefore the lack of usage in the future it might occur. Human errors and losing the device, it sounds a bit peculiar, but I mean, we all know that we leave them unattended on top of the fridge or somewhere else, and we are human beings. We forget them in the office, we forget them anywhere, and no device, no data, no benefit really. And the sense of value, some of the users reported to us they don't see the sense of value, which is a perception. The value is there, the output of data, but they don't see why they're using and why they should be using, because sometimes it's not a clear I mean, it's not clear the benefit aspect right away, and also privacy concerns and security concerns. And then here, if you want to dive deeper, just a slide with a bit more interaction about barriers, fears, hopes, and advantage using wearables and artificial intelligence in the healthcare space. Things from risk of hacking to reliability. A few years ago, I went to a presentation, a cybersecurity guy done a presentation. We're talking about wearables, smart devices, IoT, and he said that the hackers actually hack a fish tank, a sensor that was in a fish tank through a light sensor. I mean, who would say that? I mean, so the wearables present also different challenges to the equation, if you like. But where we are heading, very quickly, I want to touch on smart patches and skin electronics, because the wearables are taking different forms, and in here we might have better battery lives. I mean, they go on our body, they're less intrusive, if you like, and also they can be more reliable in terms of accurate data. And this is an example from a company called Kazana. They just raised 14 million pounds in a Series A fundraising with a heart seat, a smart toilet seat, where you can actually measure cardiac arrest and cardiac risk from the comfort of your home. So the wearables are going to places where we less expect. Probably now in our toilet we can do the same thing we do on our smartwatch. And we know that the big players now, such as Apple, Samsung, are working behind the scenes on perhaps trying to crack the major long-term longitudinal diseases such as diabetes. They're trying to get solutions around blood pressure and blood glucose meters and everything. The sleep disorders is a company called Beddit from Finland that was actually acquired by Apple. They had straps for monitoring sleep and also other physiological data sets. And this is the Oura Ring, this one in gold, which I particularly like. But the smart rings now, it doesn't have to be a smartwatch, it doesn't have to be a wristband. They come in different shapes and forms and transform to a bit of a fashionable tech device and accessory, if you like. And the hearables, last year, the hearables, they accounted for 40% of the all shipped wearable devices worldwide. And this is a particular company developing physiological sensors and biomarkers in the US called Valencell. They're doing great work. They're doing like blood pressure monitoring now in sensors, which is highly innovative. Yeah, I thought this was a bit of an overview about what is happening in the marketplace, what is available from an healthcare and medicine standard point of view. And the very last example is a company called, actually the app is called Anura, but the company is called Neurologics. This is where we are heading. We're heading to where there is even no wearable, non-contactless interventions. Is an app that you take a selfie in 30 seconds, does a blood, a kind of blood circulation monitoring, and comes up with a lot of different physiological and biometrical wellness data. So no wearable. About the reliability, I'm not totally sure, but that's where we are heading now, non-contactless monitoring. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Jaoa. Yes, there's some very interesting points there. If you could stop sharing your screen, we'll go into the gallery view so that we can see us all on the screen again. Going to this question for Colleen Monaghan, I think that's quite important, an important question. And what she said is not such a problem in the UK when it comes to the question of healthcare costs, since the NHS is government based. But in countries like Germany, Netherlands, and others, where medical insurance and reimbursement are serious topics to consider, who's going to take responsibility when we go the healthcare route? She said that she voted for healthcare individual responsibility, but cost is also a huge burden unless we're dealing with an already sick person. Who's going to help deal with the cost of maintaining a healthy society? So does this come down to creating an ecosystem of partners who share the benefits and the responsibility for healthcare management, not just government, but insurance companies, employers, etc. What's your thoughts on that, Steve?
Well, there's a saying when we work in the US with healthcare payers and providers, which is you've got to get close to the dollar. It matters who pays for this, and it is a direct concern to large-scale healthcare organizations that are insurance driven. So that diabetes example I gave you is absolutely, well, actually, and the rheumatoid arthritis are both on the radar of those kinds of organizations, specifically because they provide tools that allow individuals to be informed about their different risk, and then to be able to go on and target resource at them. You know, I said diabetes complications cost $440 billion a year. You move the needle 1%, you've saved $4.5 billion. There's some pretty significant returns that are directly relevant to insurance-led organizations, aside from the fact that they're in a marketplace and they have to reduce premiums and improve outcomes for their patients.
Joe.
Well, traditionally, it's a very good question, Colleen, by the way, because traditionally we expect the healthcare system to take care of things, cost, set up the interventions. But I think we heading away where the patient, or this time the individual, has to have more responsibility. And also we can look at insurance companies are already setting this kind of norm about rewarding the insurees by looking after the health with rewards, using wearables or not using wearables. But also the future leads in that way, isn't it? I mean, with the doctors now, we don't actually see the doctors taking patient data from wearables, but I think it's just a matter of time where we have full responsibility around our data, around our interventions, and we'll be responsible for it. But in terms of cost is always the issue, isn't it? I mean, who's going to pay? Even using a wearable, now nobody subsidizes wearables, but in the future will be this consideration for governments and healthcare organizations and providers to think, actually, would it be more beneficial and economic to give someone a wearable that costs, for example, 100 euros, and we're going to save in the long run, or not? So are all these things to debate, really.
Can I just share just a few more slides with you to share an analogy, which I think is quite relevant to this discussion to do with the costs and our approaches of where we go from here. And this is actually a quote from Sir Simon Stevens. It's not a recent one, it's quite some time ago. And it's about the transition from cure to prevention. And what it's essentially saying is that we need to improve our personal behaviors, and to do so at an early age. But to use a kind of analogy, the analogy that I like to think of is that you can think of your body as a vehicle. And looking at two vehicles on the screen there, on the left-hand side, you see an old MG, which was my partner's car from the 1950s, a beautiful car, and the car that I drive now, which is a little Mini. And if you look at these vehicles and consider them, consider your body as analogous to a vehicle which takes you on life's journey. We know what the journey is in our life, from the cradle to the grave. We know what the starting point is anyway. We know what the final destination is, but we really don't know where we're going to visit en route, or how difficult the journey and how enjoyable that journey is going to be. And so if our body is the vehicle that's going to take us on life's journey, and we want the most enjoyable life experience, what can we do to make sure that we do make that journey as enjoyable and painless as possible? And to use the car analogy, going back in time to the 1950s, this is a picture of a Humber Snipe, which is my uncle's car. He was the first person in our street to have a car. And this is what we used to use to go away in the summer holidays and sometimes at the weekends. And the reliability of this car was such that before we ever went anywhere, my uncle and my dad used to do maintenance on the car, check the oil, clean the spark plugs. And even then, the car used to break down on the journey. And there were lots of places where we used to salute as being places where we'd broken down in the past. So in those days, we really needed the knowledge professionals, the garage people, to be able to look after our vehicles, and we're very, very reliant upon them. And so the consequences of this lack of technology in older vehicles was more breakdowns and reliances on professionals. But where we look where we are today, the sensor technologies that are built into modern vehicles give us a lot of information, not only to tell us the state of the vehicle, or how much petrol there is, or whether the oil pressure, temperature, etc. But also they tell us where we are on our journey and help us to get there. So are we actually moving to a situation where some of the technologies that Jaoa has been showing us are going to change the dynamics of the management of our personal health in a similar way to car health management? And I show this picture not to boast of my body beautiful, but just to show you the impact of use of the data that you can get from wearables, and the insight it gives you into personal health did allow me to morph myself in the period of 3 months from the picture you see on the left-hand side, which was taken on stage in a play in Leicester, to on the right-hand side, some 3 months later, when I was 21 kilos less. So wearables and embedded lifestyle technologies do give us the opportunity to manage our health. I don't know whether you have any involvement or responsibility for this, Steve, but this was actually in the paper just yesterday about a product called DNA Nudge, which links a DNA profile to advice on what kind of food is good for you. So I will ask you, Steve, probably putting you on the spot. Do you have any connections with DNA Nudge, or is it something similar to what you've been developing yourself?
No, we don't. And the one thing I would say about the dietary industry is it's an unregulated industry, so you don't need to have a lot of qualifications or know how to make recommendations to people. Actually, I think that's one of the problems. There's a great deal of pent up interest in being healthier without having to do the kind of work that you had to do to lose 21 kilos. And I think that it is something where tools that give you a more ubiquitously present in your life and easier to adopt, the sort of things that Jao's talking about, they have a huge role, but we do have to be very careful that there is a difference between the detailed science that we're talking about that's driving the kind of recommendations that are going to be necessary and meaningful in a clinical setting are not necessarily the same standard of evidence being met in the consumer side of the world,
Yeah,
which is actually the same on the sensor side as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I don't know whether you found this, Jaoa, but it's been my perception that one of the barriers, which is really related to what Steve was just saying, that one of the barriers to device manufacturers getting into the clinical environment is this avoidance of litigation. They have to avoid providing something which is prescriptive as far as health advice is concerned for fear of litigation. Do you see that as being a problem with some wearables and other types of devices?
Yeah, good point. I see many companies, David, good point. I see many companies avoiding the clinical and the medical device route because, well, because of regulation, because of it takes time, it takes money for let's say for a young innovative company to get to the other side. It might take years, 3-4 years to get into the marketplace. But yeah, some companies are very reluctant to really give a prediction, a personalized prediction around certain conditions, because if you get it wrong, we're not just talking about lifestyle and wellness, isn't it? If you get it wrong, I give you an example, a comparison. If you have a Fitbit, it might have a discrepancy of 10 or 20% of physical activity and steps compared to other wearable device with a Garmin, and you wake up in the morning, it says 200 steps. I mean, you just got out of bed, you didn't do 200 steps, you just done one. It's an accelerometer, isn't it? So the reliability is an issue. But also the companies, I mean, you can't give, for example, a discrepancy of 10 or 20% in a data set if you're talking about a cardiovascular disease, in atrial fibrillation, or in diabetes if we talk about glucose meters and everything. So it's very, I mean, it's very delicate, really.
Yeah, I think it is. Going back to the cost of these things, who should bear it? You know, do you think that there's a couple of areas I want to just explore. One is the benefit to employers by providing digital therapy tools as being a way of differentiating themselves from other employers, you know, by giving their employees devices which help them to manage their own health, and in building in incentives for employees that look after themselves better, in the same way that insurance companies now are giving in incentives to people who have devices fitted in the car that show that they drive responsibly. Do you see that happening, Steve?
Well, I'm not a great fan of those in-car devices, but I may say something more about the way I drive.
Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, particularly if you look at the US, where you see a lot of the large corporations are essentially self-insured. It's essentially a zero net sum. You know, they can, because they have healthier employees, they save so much on their overall insurance premium that they can pay back those rewards to, you know, to reward good behavior. That's the wrong word. A choice of healthy lifestyles amongst their employees and their families. So it works very well. And for those people who are actively interested in their health, I think yes, it is a big incentive. You know, Jaoa was talking about, you know, the insurance companies doing rewards for using devices and proving that you're exercising, and I do think that we should see those things happening. There is a real definable, quantifiable cost of ending up even in the NHS, of ending up with a diabetes diagnosis, and if you act to prevent that, I think you should share some of those rewards.
Yeah. What about you, Jaoa?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned before that we are heading in that direction, but also I was actually in corporate wellness for a number of years, and Of course, companies have an interest in. It's always the return on investment on the table. Is always the issue. You invest, I don't know, $1, you get $3. But there are many studies that actually prove. I mean, from the employee well-being to the employee absence to productivity, there are a lot of companies doing work around that, and it's a win-win situation because, I mean, you also support the employee to get healthier and you save money in the long run. But some companies are still doing the talk, not doing the walk. But that's a different story, isn't it? Because it's easy to say, we're actually doing something for our employees, but it's always money involved. It's got to be an investment in the first place, you know.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the problems also is, and I certainly know this is true in my own motivation for health management, and that is that there is a time lag between bad behavior, inappropriate diet, and when the chickens come home to roost. So I will exercise tomorrow. I will not eat that chocolate. I will eat the chocolate today, and it won't be there tomorrow. This is one of the big problems that I foresee. And also, I make the observation again from my own personal experience that although I have religiously done 10,000 steps almost every day for the last 7 years, the ease with which you can comply with these health regimes very much depends upon your life circumstances. It was very much easier for me when I lived on my own than it is living with a partner who enjoys food and a glass of wine the same as I do. I'll just have a look to see if there's any other questions we just got time to deal with before we close. Yes, the other point which I wanted to discuss, and I will touch on, and that is to do with data privacy and the societal benefits of sharing data. You know, is there an argument that says that if you become what you might call a quantified self, where you have devices that are capturing all this data about yourself and you're being honest about your own personal health condition, when you go into a hospital and you're able to present all that data, you're likely to be looked after better because they will know more about you and your history and all of that technology. So is it reasonable for somebody to say that if you don't collect that data and if you don't share that data with your clinicians, can you expect the same level of care if something goes wrong?
I think the clinician has to have tools that allow them to use that data. At the moment, nobody knows how to use Fitbit data. You could turn up with 3 years of Fitbit data and your clinician would look at you blankly.
Yes.
So the frameworks have got to be there. I think very quickly, just collecting your own data doesn't mean that you have to share it all willy-nilly in order to get these benefits. I think there are tools that can operate on the devices that you own securely, never sharing that information. And there are also frameworks like smart contracts that can enable you to share very selectively with chosen partners and actually be remunerated for that sharing if value is created. So yeah, that's a very quick answer to the
question. That's a good answer. That's the kind of answer I would have given if I'd got the intelligence to do it. Jaoa, what would you say?
Yeah, I was trying to answer Wendy's question there because there's some questions there. I was typing. Yeah, I mean it's difficult. I do agree with Steve, and I was doing like an interview this morning on my YouTube channel with an advocate lady on anti-resistance and antibiotic medication, and we're talking about the doctors not having time to actually address the patients in appropriate way. I mean, for example, if you have a problem, you have different types of medications. If you go to different doctors, nobody knows what's going on. They don't have the time to do a 30-minute research on you, a background check, where you've been, in which hospital, what you're taking before. So I think fundamentally, it's not an issue just around the data. It's about the the setup of the healthcare environments that we live in. I mean, I know very well the reality of the NHS, and if you go to a GP in UK, you get 10 minutes, if so, yeah. And that's the reality. It's not a criticism to the doctor or anything. They do a great job because they see 10 minutes, 30 patients a day or 40. So they're not going to have the time to deal with Fitbit data or any wearables data or any background checks or preventative interventions or any, they do a great job. So it is an issue fundamentally of the way healthcare is delivered. And that's something for us, the professionals, to put out there that something's got to change in the near future. And I think we are heading in that direction,
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Well, we're actually at the end of time now, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to deal with all of the questions and comments that have been put in, but all of these questions are being stored, and I'm going to send them to both Steve and Jaoa to ask if they want to respond to those questions, and we can get back to the people who've answered them because we have those records. So it just remains for me just to bring the polling question back up again and ask the next polling question, which essentially is the same question, and to ask you if you still think the same as you did right at the very beginning, where do you think the focus should be on preventative healthcare now and in the future? Thank you very much for your responses, and also thank you very much for your attention and your involvement in this webinar. We are at the end of time, so I'm going to end the polling now and just share the result. 90% say that we should focus on empowering citizens, give greater responsibility for personal health management. I'm sorry again, we probably didn't do justice completely to the topic, but there will be other events and webinars, and I hope very much that Steve and Jaoa will join me again on future events. I'll just ask first of all Steve and then Jaoa just for any closing remarks that you want to make before we conclude.
No, I'm great. Thank you very much for the invite to speak. It's lovely to debate these topics. But as you can see, my heart is in not having people get sick in the first place. And if we can, the more we can do to avoid that, the more resource there will be in the health systems to treat the people who truly need our help.
Absolutely. Jaoa?
Yeah, sure, David. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for the audience to engage with us in some way. I think one of the fundamental things is I do a lot of work in digital health, as you know, but technology is there, innovation is there. Now we're entering a different phase where we really realize that health systems, preventative care, all these things that we've been talking about for ages, that we need to develop those agendas in moving them forward as quick as we can. Because otherwise we'll have technology, we'll have innovation, and we're not really taking advantage of what is out there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent note to close on. So thank you to Steve, thank you to Jaoa, and thank you very much to all of you who joined us this afternoon. This has been recorded and it will be published on YouTube. So those who weren't able to attend will be able to access it after today. So thank you once again.